Our next guest for the Mindset Shift is Mark Bennett, Director of the Innovation Hub at Trinity College Dublin. He has previously worked in sustainability, startups and smart cities in the USA, the UK and across Europe, in the public and private sectors. He has also enjoyed being a startup founder and the chair of an environmental NGO. Welcome to the Mindset Shift, and you're making a little bit of history today in that you're the first guest who's actually standing for the Mindset Shift, because every other guest today has decided to sit down like I do.
Well, I'm delighted to be first. It's nice to be first at something during today. As I was saying earlier, it gives you that sense of freedom maybe when you're chatting.
So listen, the whole purpose of the Mindset Shift is to find out about the person behind the career, not just about the career and what the person is currently doing. So tell me a little bit about yourself, your background and where you're from.
Well, where I'm from is an easy one because I'm from Delgany in Wicklow. And maybe that had some influence on what I then wanted to do. So where I grew up, at the bottom of the garden, it led out onto an area of land that had previously been a nursery, but there had been a fire in the building of the nursery. So it was this wonderful ruin that kids could go and, scratch their names. But also it meant all the plants that were there all went wild and propagated. And it was a magical little space. And so then in school and then in university, I was very interested in geography, the environment. So I ended up studying environmental science in Trinity in Dublin. And then from there, I went to the States and I worked for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, so the EPA there. And that was also a transformative experience because I began to realize if you have an interest in environment, well, you better learn about business, because in fact that interplay is really what's making the difference. And all of this is, we can see that now in the discourse that we have around environment. It's not a separate thing, it's sustainability. They're all interlinked. So when I came back to Europe, I went to King's College in London to study an MSc in international management. And then had a brief sojourn of a year or two in Italy, and then went back to London and worked in the public sector in the environmental area. And then, in life, I really resist having those significant birthdays be precipitating life decisions because it's a bit arbitrary. However, I could see 30 coming down the track and I thought, which way am I going to go? Will I be a perennial expat, which is a great life and lots to recommend it? Or will I go home? Because I was coming close to 30 and I thought, well, only by going home can I fully make the decision consciously. So I said, well, what will I do before I go home? One last gasp of international experience. So I went to work in the European Commission in DG Environment. And that was a great decision because I realized how that all worked and what the realpolitik of European politics is in administration and bureaucracy. But I also met my wife there. So that was a great little experience. And then I took a year out and went traveling around the world. So went to China, that was back in 2006. So, China had already started to change, but I've no doubt if I went back again, it would be transformed. And then I came back to Ireland. I really was interested in getting involved in corporate social responsibility. That was the specialism of my master's. But the markets between the UK and Ireland were differentially developed, let's put it kindly. So I ended up setting up my own consultancy and in corporate social responsibility, and most of my clients were in the UK. So I spent my life on an airplane. And the pro rata, anybody who's in that game, your pro rata income is great. But what I realized was that I wasn't building a life for myself in Dublin, and that was the point. So a job came up with Dublin City Council on the sustainability side, and crucially it was working with businesses on the sustainability side. So it was that nice kind of interplay of those two areas that I was so interested in. And then I spent 7 years working with Dublin City Council on various different projects, but I was very well treated in there, I have to say. They gave me great latitude to do what I felt were interesting things around green finance, around electrification of transport. It was policy, it was implementation, it was great. But then it too, had, I was coming up to another significant birthday. So I was coming up to 40 then. I thought, well, there's certain things. I'd set up my own business, but I felt that the consultancy, I wanted to do a business that could scale beyond me. Now, ultimately, the lesson is I wasn't able to, but I decided I'd give it a go. So I set up a company in kind of high technology. It was working with Trinity Connect Center, and it was to create tracking for objects in cities. And I took the use case of bicycles. How can you protect people's bicycles? If people's bicycles get stolen, they're more likely not to replace it than to replace it. So that's a huge public impact, personal impact for those people, health and environment. So it was really good. I got onto an accelerator in Switzerland. They paid me to go over. It was fab. It was a great little experience. But towards the end of that, despite working with Swisscom and AXA on the project, I realized it wasn't going to be the rocket. And I'd been around the startup land enough to realize that it's very hard. Going out on your own, anybody who's done it, it's very, very hard. And you eat, sleep, drink it constantly. And so it's got to have a payback. And I kind of thought you have to know when to quit. So I did. And then happily somebody tapped me on the shoulder about a great job up in DCU with a company called Talent Garden. So their international co-working space had just done a 43 million euro raise to expand throughout Europe. And it was great, got onto leadership with them. And I only left in November, and I hold a fond place in my heart for them because it was just a crazy ride. It was super, I often talk about how we had family meetings. I even think a company that uses terminology like family meetings, it can be a bit, cloying sometimes, unless you really like the people, I suppose. It's like somebody reaching in for a hug. It all depends on who they are. So, but I kind of felt a bit of a warm embrace from that company. I had a great time with them, and we had family meetings in, Milan. The whole company of 160 people ended up in a villa in Milan to talk about our feelings, fab, and also the strategy and how we're going to raise, millions more. But so I really enjoyed that experience. But, a little bit before November, the opportunity came up in Trinity, and, that being my, where I did my undergraduate degree. I live in Temple Bar, so it's just down the road. And, Trinity has just such a great reputation. And the project that I'm working on now, which is, another innovation hub, it just has so much potential for impact. And I think when, the pandemic had already hit when I went for this job, but we were like in the pandemic. And so nobody wanted to talk about green shoots because we didn't have line of sight on a vaccine. We just didn't know, of course, globally, which end of us was up. And I don't want to talk about green shoots quite yet. I won't fall into that trap. But I think it's beholden on us now to imagine, well, what is the future going to look like? And as I imagine the future, I imagine this location in the Docklands as being a really impactful part of that. And really, when we see political changes and financial, potentially corporate tax changes coming down the track, we're going to have to change gear and have other things than a young educated workforce and a low corporation tax and, gateway to Europe. And we've got to have other things that we talk about. And I think an innovation district in the center of our major capital city, I think will be a very positive thing. So I'm really delighted to work on something with impact. That's something that I've always tried to do whilst, making enough money to live, because that's important also.
So rather than talk about the future, let's go right back to Delgany. And I'm fascinated about the fact that, your vision of Delgany and the openness of the space and, the runes and, scratching your name on the wall. What was your family setup like as a child?
Great. So just in case just in case my mom is ever watching this, I have to say it was amazing. I have to say it was formative, and you couldn't have asked for better. But it's going to sound a bit silly, but I couldn't have asked for better, I have to say. Or maybe that's just the way that we are as human beings. Maybe it's rose tinted, but if I go back to how it was for me at that point, it was a nice house with a bit of land. So I was making like amazing flying machines for myself. So good wind would get up on the brow of the hill, and I'd be like banging things together with bits of plastic to try and get some air, climbing up and falling out of trees, I used to, every day I'd come home from school, I'd run up to the woods and to what's called View Rock. So it looks out over Greystones. Like, that's just incredible. And then on the weekends, I'd time myself to run up to the top of the Sugarloaf, and then I'd see the rest of the city, and, and it's just, maybe one of the, as I've learned, for me to make my way through this life in the best way possible, it's about maintaining different perspectives, and understanding if you're stuck in one, that there's another one a little bit higher that might give you some resolution. And who knows? It sounds a bit too easy, but maybe those experiences of regularly getting up high, getting some, air in your lungs, I've always found that to be very useful. And so things like running and cycling have always been a big part of my life.
So tell me about your family setup, in the sense of, were you the only child? Had you siblings?
I'm just that difficult one who, my parents had me, and then it was 4.5 years till my next sibling came along. So I was probably spoiled and the center of attention for just that little bit too long before, and then the others came along. But, my sister, Jane, I have another sister, Kathy, and my brother, David, we're a very tight family. We're very, high functioning is probably a wrong word, because it shouldn't, being functional isn't the point of a family necessarily. But, it was a nice balance of ages. We were in a nice situation. We had a nice little thing going there in Delgany. And then, it's hard to leave that then. But, when I left, I decided I really wanted to leave. So when I left college, I then went abroad. So, it's hard to pull yourself away. There you go.
And tell me about that 4.5 year gap, because it is a factor. You're the eldest, so there's a 4.5 year gap. You're spoiled. You have all the attention, and then your sister arrives. So in your formative years, so going beyond that, was that a factor? Were you conscious of that, or did you just basically get on with it?
I mean, Tim, you're, let's say I was 9, and here's this 5.5-year-old who wants to come and play with me and my friends climbing the trees. She's like, oh my God, Jane, please, you're ruining my cool. And I have to say that's a fact. Now, I you want to be a good brother, so I always did try to do that, but you can't help but be like, I need my freedom. I'm 9 now, sure, I'm mostly grown up. And then, over time, you begin to realize the privilege. So I have one son, Tommy, and he's the world to me, obviously. But you realize the privilege, I think, a little bit when you get older. You realize the privilege of having siblings. And then I find it like one of my greatest privileges is to be a big brother to 2 sisters and to a younger brother. And he's 9 years younger than me. There's something pleasing about them thinking you're always right just by dint of being older. That goes some way. But it's more than that. It's more that you, another thing that you learn through life is the more you do for others, that's kind of, there's a positive feedback loop for that. And it's just, I think family is extraordinarily important. And I think going away taught me that as much as being home. So I was 10 years away in total. And so, yeah, fun. What to say, absence makes the heart grow fonder.
It's interesting the point about what you do for others. There's a great saying in the film The Wizard of Oz. When the wizard is giving the lion, he's giving the Tin Man a heart. And he says a heart is judged not how much by it loves, but by how much it is loved. And that really is a sign of the fact that, you ought to be giving. So as an older brother, you have 2 younger sisters and a younger brother. And other than the fact that they did spoil your coolness from time to time, it's nice to hear the fact
there wasn't much there in the first place, Tim. What little I had.
Yeah, but it is interesting though, because it is a factor, and it is a factor families have to deal with, in the fact that when there's a gap between the eldest and the next child, the eldest just has got used to being around the place and being the only sibling in that sense. And it just takes time to adjust. And in some cases, it takes longer than one would like, but it does take time to adjust. Yeah. Your mom and dad, were they professionals outside the home, or were they inside the home?
My parents worked extraordinarily hard, I have to say. And actually, to that point about having them to myself for 4.5 years, love grows, it isn't divided. And somehow they managed as well to have time for all of us and to make us all, I think they did a good job of that. But no, they worked really hard. So my mom had me when she was in university in UCD studying, and she went on then to become a teacher. And my dad was, working as hard as, anybody ever could. And I have to say, our influences are many, but those early years, we might say, maybe not till, 5, but let's say to 9. I think 9's a really interesting point. But, all of my work ethic, I would say, just comes from watching my dad just work hard at everything. So like, no matter what, it was making the coffee, just, do it with purpose and determination and, all of those things. And, I'm a pale copy maybe of what he would be, but those attitudes, that sense of purpose, I think is pretty indelible.
It's interesting that hard work is something that you remember and you're influenced by your dad, because other people are influenced by other things by their parents, but hard work is something that is really a great trait to pass on to your children, isn't it?
Yeah, it's what's it, like tenacity, resilience, all of those things. And I use a banal example of, let's say, making the coffee, but we had a big old garden, and I always go back to when Dad decided, that was a great phrase, the decision has been made. So the decision has been made that there's a huge area of this land, it's 2.5 acres, but a good half acre was going to be turned into like a proper lawn. And as according to my dad, the stones were just the wrong size that were in the soil. So cue, this hard labor of literally going through all of this rotivated soil, just like managing it and tending to it. And I just watched my dad from morning till night, and next morning till next night, and next morning till next night, just not stopping. Just that attitude of, until this is done, we're going to keep on going with it. And this idea of like breaking things into small pieces and just put for me, I call it my donkey mode. I just put the shoulders down and just buckle in and just go for it. It's not high strategy. It's not inspirational. It's just grind. And I think the ability to grind through things, I don't know, is it the best way? I don't know, but that's just something that I have as a mental model that I use sometimes.
And tell me then, so what would be the thing from your mom that you would pick up? If you take hard work from your dad, and obviously your mom worked hard as well, but if you had a different influence from your mom, what would stand out for you?
Well, now I can just turn into a mush, because that's the bit that I got from my mom, was the super mushy. My mom's a hugger. She's full of compassion. She's just, as a primary school teacher, we'd hear about all of the kids, and she just had, my mom's, diminutive, but my goodness, the stretch on that embrace for the world, and the always looking at the world with, an optimism, and a kind of it isn't that, to serve your, like, the primary directive is to make sure your family's okay, because I don't think then I would have put the effort that I did into like our common problems, let's say, in the world. But it was, again, that kind of trick of, sharing out the time. She just seemed to have enough emotional resources to be able to spread them to everybody, and then that compassion. And, I hadn't understood my mom properly, or how it worked, or how she'd done it. And it's only in retrospect, when I kind of, more modern books. I read a really interesting book when I was in college, actually, called, it was The Dalai Lama and the Art of Happiness. And I just thought, that's of course what we should all be going for, is be happy. And that's what my mom always said, just once you're happy, make sure that you're happy. It's happiness. But you don't, that just washes over you. You don't, how deeply do you listen to your mom? Isn't that terrible to say? But that's, mom going, yeah, I heard you already. But then you go through life and you start realizing, God, that wisdom from the home. Actually, here's the Dalai Lama saying much of, what my mom said. And one of the things that stuck with me about what the Dalai Lama, for example, was saying, was this idea of engaging compassion, trying to understand, like an empathetic compassion of understanding, well, maybe the reason somebody is being such pain is because they've had a really bad day. Or imagine if you had to go through life being such a pain that you're upsetting everybody around you. that's no life, that's not a great life. So, be compassionate to the situation. And I find for me, that it kind of diffuses sometimes my reaction to a situation. So instead of fronting up, and I'm not saying that I don't, that I don't get upset. I'm as far from the Dalai Lama as you could imagine. But I do find, again, these kind of mental hacks or tricks that allow you to make a smoother passage through life, let's say, or a more functional, again, functional way through life.
It's interesting you talk about your mom and the Dalai Lama and the comparisons. And, I think most mothers, have that innate compassion, that innate love, that innate affection, that innate willingness to give so much to others, their children and others in that sense, which we take for granted because, they're our mom and, they're our dad, and we just take that for granted. But it's lovely for me to hear, Mark, you reminiscing now, on, and even the smile as you're thinking about, what those traits that your mom and your dad brought you from Delgany, and it's a number of years ago, obviously, right? But it's still nice to remember it, that it's a real foundation of what you've become.
Yeah, and I'm very conscious of that now, being a parent myself and seeing my own little boy in those, I can't remember when I was 5.5, not really. I've seen photographs of my 6th birthday. That looked like a good one, dressed up as a cowboy and all of that stuff. So he's beginning to enter those times where, maybe when he was a baby in the cot, he was being formed then, but in a different way, maybe as a reaction. So you never stop forming, but I can see him entering now the phase of where, a kind word versus a stern word, or, a situation that he's put into that will stretch him or will put him ill at ease, and I suppose you always have to find the right balance. I mean, not all of the formative experiences that I value were pleasant experiences, but I suppose because, knowing that there was parents there who would be supportive of you if you fell, that was the most important thing.
I think it's a very important point that you made a point about Tommy, that, the words you say to him, the different reaction he has in that sense. And that's the same at professional level. That's the same in employment world, saying a nice word instead of saying a harsh word, when either word can make such a difference. It's very easy to say a harsh word. It's much more important to say nice words when they're merited, obviously, in that sense. And also, if you have to say a harsh word, say it with the understanding that it will impact, and the impact it will have on the individual. You have to say it, but you still have to understand that as an impact. And I think we see that more when we say it to children, as you said, Tommy, because it's more visible. Adults tend to try and hide it more, but it's lovely to hear that the engagement having now your son will form his world in that sense. And, you'll be him, what your dad was to you, you'll be his dad. And, there'll be things that he'll remember that dad brought, to his world, Tell me a bit, Mark, about Trinity. Obviously the nursery and Delgany.
But I might just pause that and say that my wife also brings up my child, because I think I haven't mentioned my wife, and she is, the most important with Tommy person in my life. And the great thing is that if daddy has a stern word, he can run to mommy. If mommy has a stern word, he can run to daddy. Unfortunately, in business, we don't have our mommy or daddy there to pat us on the back when somebody says a stern word.
You actually did mention your wife earlier. You said you met your wife when you were on the European Commission. So you did actually mention your wife. And there is no doubt that your wife has a huge role in bringing up Tommy. Yeah. And so that's not even taken for granted. That's just a statement of fact. So I definitely didn't miss that point. I can assure you, Mark, Let me just talk about Trinity, and obviously Delgany, the nursery, the environmental experience you had growing up, sort of set your formative thoughts about going into Trinity. What was life like in Trinity for you, those years in Trinity?
Well, I suppose, back then, transportation connectivity wasn't what it is now. And so Delgany, Greystones, they felt quite removed. We'd come in, both my parents were, from Ranelagh and Rathmines. So, we would make the pilgrimage to see the nanas and granddads and all of that. But, we didn't inhabit the city. And the way people can now a little bit more easily hop on the Dart. The Dart didn't go to Greystones, for example. It's just a little bit harder. So I was at a remove from our capital city, despite not being that far away. So when I came into the city, it was a little bit of a revelation. I felt a bit more I wasn't visiting. Now I was literally in the center of it. And of course, that's a great thing for Trinity. it is literally the center of the city. And you meet new friends. So you invent yourself again, or you develop parts of yourself that you like the most, or you maybe start to develop some kind of a vision of who you want to be, and you surround yourself with people who maybe have a similar vision. And I have to say, like, the friends that I made in college, I mean, they've stood all these years. It's remarkable, you know, whereas work colleagues who maybe sometimes you have like very intense experiences with, you know, life-changing, the business works well, doesn't work well, whatever, but it's not the same. I don't know whether it's a different frame, it's a different age. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe we were all full of promise and, you know, we were more open. But, you know, I've a lot to be grateful to Trinity for. I think during that experience, I also worked in a bar, you know, to make money, to be able to go out and enjoy myself. And I think it'd be remiss of me to mention one and not the other, because in terms of influences, working in a bar, being a barman, being the other side of the bar, let's say. So, you know, that was hugely informative as well. But look, the great thing about when I was in Trinity, and it was a little bit like when I was in the European Commission, I was allowed to fully be the nerd that I wanted to be. So you couldn't be, let's say, the coolest thing as well. You'd be insufferable to talk about some of the stuff you'd be chatting to your classmates about, you know, getting deep and really esoteric on the environmental side. And that was great because you didn't have to moderate yourself. And I found also when I went to the European Commission, you're allowed to be a total Euro nerd, you know, and it was wonderful, you know. You couldn't live in that bubble all the time. But no, it was an amazing 4 years. I felt that I really changed as a person from having gone to college in Trinity. Now, I didn't go to college anywhere else. So maybe it's like at the same time. I'm not sure whether UCD would have had the same transformational experience, Belfast, UCC, who knows? But certainly, I couldn't fault Trinity for giving me the opportunity to become whatever self I turned into.
It's interesting you use the word nerd and the bubble of your classmates, I suppose, and that therefore you can express yourself fully in that environment because, you know, you're all interested in the same thing, and therefore there's no moderation, to take your word, on the conversation. Because if you take the conversation at that point in time out of that environment and have it with, you know, people in the bar, well, it kind of has a nerdy connotation to it. Did that help your confidence growing yourself? I mean, did you see yourself, you know, become more confident as an individual during that number of years in Trinity?
Yeah, I think so. You know, but I you know, for me, it just felt like this was the time then, you know. And look, this is why I feel so bad for those people who are going to college but not going to college. So let's say this year with the pandemic, and maybe facing into a lot, you know, maybe even longer away from the universities around. It really does allow you to become an adult. Sure, you know, you become an adult 16, 18, you know, but you're out there on your own, and you're out of the school environment, that kind of embrace of the things that you've known, you know, all the way through your childhood. And you're normally, for people, in something completely different, with completely different people, and with people who have different, you know, even if you look at lecturers, I mean, yes, they have an interest in improving you and giving you their knowledge, but they also have other interests. I mean, your teachers in school, it's what they do for their living. But often when you go in and lecturers, but they have their own specialisms, they have their own research priorities, they have other things going on. They're giving you some of their time, but not all of their time, you know. And so if you're going to take their time, it better be worth it. That better be a good question. Because we're not here to do, you know, oh, Mark needs to get through these, you know, it's an entirely different relationship. And if you don't adult up, well, that's going to be harder for you and you won't get the most out of it. And I think, you know, that's when I began to expect a little bit more of myself, of others, of life. You know, my expectations grew.
I think there's great clarity in that answer about the difference between, say, second level school and college. You know, in second level and primary and second level school are similar. The teachers are there for you. They're there, you know, to do the best for you in that sense. Where in college, it's up to you. It really, it is a switch. It is this big switch from the fact that, you must get the best out of the lecturer for whatever time he or she has with you. And also, also agree with your point. It's tough right now on college students that are not getting the intersocial interaction that, you would take for granted in your college and those particularly formative adult years.
Yeah, but I would say though, Tim, I think that young people now who are going into college have come up in a different way as well. Yeah. So I don't know, maybe it's not like, for me, if I was to make digital what my real world experience was for college, it wouldn't be the same. But I think that they inhabit an entirely different digital native world. So maybe it's not as jarring for them. And I hope not. I hope they're doing okay.
That's a reasonable point. I still would believe, though, that the social interaction that we would expect from people and that we enjoy with people, you can even see it in the pandemic that many of the students, are still trying to find social outlets for each other because they do miss that. But there's no doubt that the digital world of 2021 compared to your college time of, I think you finished on 96, 97. If you take back in 2006 when you came back to Ireland. So it's just a different, digital experience and interaction, but it still is, it's a challenge for them,
Yeah.
Let me talk to you about the big decision then to, you leave with a Trinity degree in environmental science and you go to the EPA in the USA, which is like a complete transformation of culture, environment. How did that come about? I'm fascinated by that.
Well, I wanted to go to where it was at. That's so you do in fact have the whole world to choose from, and and as Irish people, I think we have to remember that. I mean, you couldn't be luckier. It's an amazing privilege to be as globally connected as this island is, a little island on the edge of Europe, and we have a diaspora across the world. We have a passport that's respected across the world. So why not go directly to where the power is, to where the source is? So I think this back in letters as well. So I sent letters to every, it's divided into regions. Region 5 is the one that I went to in Chicago. I wrote to all of the regions, and got response back from one. And then they said, oh, we'd like to have can you call us? I was like, oh, so I ended up, I was like, well, I don't know how much. So I ended up going down to a payphone down in Greystones, and I was like putting it in, and yeah. Anyway, by hook or somehow, I managed to convince them. And then I went to use it on Aston Key, and they had a competition running for like supporting people who were doing interesting things. So I went in and made my pitch to them. I got them to fund, my transportation to get out there. And it was great. But it really was just like this lone voice in the wilderness saying, take me. And I was funny, when I went in, the team that I went to work with was working in Lithuania, and they were working with Valdas Adamkus, was the regional administrator in Chicago. He went on to become the president of Lithuania.
Okay.
So the State Department had given him leave to kind of essentially go and go into the election to be president. And I think the idea was that if he didn't, then he could come back, And right. So he had brought his management team over and said, look, have a look at this environmental. They didn't have what we would consider to be an EPA or environmental ministry, etc. And yet they wanted to accede to the European Union. And so they needed to do a big management reorg. So I went in, nobody was around. So I was told by somebody, well, you can use that office. And it was the office of the director. And I went in and I was tapping away. And of course, they all thought that I was internal affairs. They're like, who's this kid, coming in? And I was put the tie on, as if I was somebody. And I was just like wet behind the ears. But anyway, then I got a couple of emails saying, oh, we're looking at different, ways to set this thing up. So I went up to the library in the place and I just ate the library until I had all of these schema of how you could set these things up. So it was great. So it ended up being, the project was a management audit of the Lithuanian Minister of the Environment, let's say. But it was great. I actually they flew me to Washington then to present it because I'd done a huge amount of work before they came back. So I was still in college mode. It was still just like eating the books and, just, this was my life. I inhabited it fully. And they gave me a Federal Appreciation Award. That was the first they'd ever given to an intern. It was just good times,
That's really cool. That's really cool to get it. Yeah,
With Federal Appreciation Award looks really nice,
Yes, yeah, no, it's really cool. It's really cool,
Yeah.
and that getting any award is really cool, but getting one that is sort of given to an intern, which is not consistently what happens, is really exceptionally cool.
Yeah. And then they were lovely people, so I remember that very fondly as well.
And then you stayed a number of years, and you decided to go back to college because you made a point earlier on that you saw the connection between the environment and business,
Yeah.
particularly in the EPA world. Why did you want to go back and do management then? Was it just because you wanted to develop that part of your career?
Yeah, well, I've always, so it goes deep, this, but I wanted to do environmental, social, economic, and this is part of the economic bit. And when I went in, I decided so I came back to Ireland after my period in the States, and I just worked 2 jobs. I worked for Siemens and I worked in a bar, and I just worked as much money as I could get to pay I think it was £10,000, I think, for the masters in London. And then went over, and what I wanted to do with it was do corporate social responsibility. So it was a taught master's, but I'd specialized in CSR. So that one I really got into it as well. So the thesis, again, taught master's, but the thesis that I did, the final thesis, I did it on Shell Oil and something called the ideal speech situation and corporate social responsibility. And I really enjoyed that as well. And I ended up getting it published in the Journal of Accounting Organization and Society, which is published out of Oxford. So it was great within your master's to get your thesis published. Now, obviously with my thesis supervisor, Jeffrey Unerman, who was a wonderful person to work with. So he, suggested, would I like to go into academia? But by that point I was, I decided I want to go and live in Italy for a while. But it's something I often wonder, you have these decision points in your life.
Yes.
And when I was working in London, there was that decision point: do I go to, the European Commission or not? And I have to say that was one of the best decisions I ever made, because, I have my beautiful wife as a result of that. So it's interesting how your life could have been different.
Yeah, and we've got to take, the turn that we decide to take at whatever point in time, and make the best of that journey then. That's all we can do, because, looking back and saying, if I went the other way, I think all of us can look back and say, if we had went a different journey, how would our life have worked out?
Yeah.
But I think most of us end up with the life that's, we wanted to work out. As you said, you've a lovely wife, smashing child, Tommy. So we end up, and you're now in an environment in Trinity where you're really excited about it. I'm fascinated about
I also think, Tim, there's that thing of, sometimes when we look back, things could have been different. It's almost to discount the rest of your life, as if that's it, like where you are is where you're going to be. Whereas everything is just the preamble to the big thing. That's the way I always look at it anyway. As long as there's a couple of years left, sure, who knows what might happen.
I think what we tend to do, Mark, is we tend to say, we want everything we have now, all the good things that we have, all the great experiences and the environment that we have right now, and the excitement of if we'd done a different journey. So we don't want the different journey to end up in a different place. We want all the good things of today. And we want to have, and I think that's just, that's the humanity in this, the exploring what if we had went down this road, what would it have done for us, But I think most of us end up, as I said, in good roads, despite the journey, the twist and turn we take,
Yeah.
Tell me about Italy, because that's, because you said that the professor was asking about academia and you decided to go to Italy. That's kind of unusual, Was Italy just for fun, exploring? What was the Italian journey about?
Oh, well, that was just being young and in love.
Okay.
So when I was in London, I was in college rooms and met somebody, and we decided to see, where would that go? And that person was from Italy, and I said, well, I'll go to Italy too. And we had a great time, but she and I, it just wasn't written in the stars. So we came back to London and made a go of it. But, not everything can work out. And again, you would go back and you would say, well, what if that had worked out? But I think you have to go through these things, they're just part of being human. You sometimes wish them away because of the pain that they can cause, but then you realize that, it's like a chemical reaction. You have to bring it up to a certain temperature, or thaw it down to a certain temperature. It's got the light and the dark. That's all part of it.
Did you learn to speak Italian?
I did, yeah. And it took me a while, I have to say. So I'd studied German in school and did it at night in college. So I mean, why I couldn't have hooked up with the German, is beyond me. And I sent my child to a German school in Clonski, but I liked Italian because, when I was in secondary school, I went into French for 2 weeks and I had to leave and go to German because I couldn't be doing with all of the kind of Plomosi, French thing. I just couldn't get my head around it. And it just sounded too, I don't know, it was too demonstrative, and I don't know, I liked the sternness of the German. But by the time I'd gone through college and had my experiences in the States and gone to London, I was quite in the mood for something theatrical. And I just loved with Italian. I probably still have the hangover of that year, of those times, of just the gesticulation and the passion and you can speak Italian sometimes without saying anything because you're just, using your hands. And I really enjoyed it. And I was able to work, actually, I worked for Intesa Bank. They were having a World Bank meeting. The IMF and the World Bank were meeting. And so we were organizing between different banks. So I was working between English and Italian. So I got okay. But actually that was when September 11th hit. So all of that work was for naught, but sure, that was nothing in comparison to, the importance of what had happened. But I remember being in Piazza della Scala, looking at the TVs in the shops showing what was happening in New York at that time. So that's obviously indelibly etched in my mind.
And are there any other languages that you speak?
I'm trying to speak Spanish as best I can, given my wife is Argentinian. So, my comprehension is pretty good, but my little boy Tommy wipes the floor with me when it comes to Italian. I think, unfortunately, I've relied on my Italian to forgive my Spanish. So when I go to Argentina, for example, I kind of slip into a bit of Italian that gets me through a tight spot, so, but it's quite nice how, as Tommy's talking to my wife in more complex language, it's like a little bit of a puzzle game that I try and keep going and catch that word and use the Latin base to try and, but yeah.
So it's fascinating you made a point about the sternness of the German language and the I suppose, extrovert aspect of the Italian language, which is very similar in many ways to the Spanish language. I definitely would have seen you, Mark, more in the Italian and Spanish space. I think that's more suited to you. I think that, the sternness of the German language, you were selling yourself short would be an observation.
Yes, well, I think it's maybe the sternness is wrong. I have to apologize to all the Germans out there. That's probably just a stereotype trope, and I apologize for that. But I think it is a very exact language. So, for example, as my wife would say, if you're talking about the law, my wife's a lawyer, the German language is very, very exact. And there's something, I think that becomes part of the trait of being German.
I'm just going to move it on a bit and just pick up a bit about your own business, and we then get to Trinity at the end. But so you've had your own, you came back then to Ireland and you did your own consultancy, which was obviously, as you said, into the UK predominantly, which had a lot of travel in that sense. And then you went to Dublin, City Council, and then you again started up, exploring your own business in the looking after bikes for individuals in that sense. Why did you find it difficult, or as difficult as you portrayed to me earlier on?
Well, what I would say is the next time I set up a business, because, like I said, it ain't over till it's over. We'll get there in the end. Is I don't think I'd pick high technology, high risk, low probability of success. I mean, it was really, what I was using was technology that hadn't even been rolled out across Dublin City. There was a research network. It was a very nascent sector. And I was going at it without previous experience in hardware. And as anybody who tries to develop a hardware business will tell you that it's hard. And they're not joking. I mean, there's big money involved, huge capital investment. I had a good run. I got Enterprise Ireland Competitive Start Fund funding. I'd done some small business innovation research grants, 60, 70, 80,000 euro coming in. The Swiss paid me 14,000 euro to go over and spend 3 months there. I had a good run, and I had some great people that I really enjoyed working with, but it never got to scale. And it was just too hard to do the administration of the business, the origination of IP, the running of proof of concepts, managing business relationships with potential customers, and just not being able to pay people. You can only take goodwill so far. And your equity, if you're asking people to do sweat equity, has to be based on a reasonable projection of income at the end of it. So you cannot say to people, guys, do you want to come in and work? And I was very lucky, and I also had corporates helping me. I had Arabs, I have to say, big shout out to Arab. They helped me do some visualizations, really all great. But just needed more money, And even if I had it, Tim, now looking back, would I have been able to pay people back? I didn't have assurance. So for example, just before I finished the business or stopped, as an act of going concern, I just won an accelerator down in Cork, this international insurance incubator, and it was backed by Kernel Capital, and it was writing the term sheet for the funding that they're about to give me that made me kind of have that, realization. Let's just stop for a minute. Let's stop selling. Let's really think about this. Let's, as if I'm two people, but like, Mark, just really think, is it fair to take people's money beyond this point? And I didn't feel it was, because I thought that I believe in the tenacity and all of that around startup, but I also think that you have to have a realistic approach. And it is sometimes, it's time to call it quits, And I think, I learned an awful lot. The people I worked with learned an awful lot. The third parties that I engaged with also learned something. They got something out of it. So I think the money was well spent all around. But again, like I said, it wasn't going to be the rocket. And if it's not going to be a rocket, well, I think somebody else who's more established could realize the potential. And actually what I was doing was then picked up by a great company in the north called C-Sense. So I had the validation of seeing that, they're running with it, but also an insight into how long it is taking, because it still hasn't come to market. And this is, 3-4 years later. So I'd have been well out of fuel by then.
It's actually a great encapsulation of the challenges of, setting up a business, or even running a business, but particularly setting up a business and all the components that come in. And what I really enjoyed was one point you made about there comes a time where you've got to be really honest with yourself. And that means whether you're setting up a new business and it's going to be successful or not, whether you're in an established business and you want to stay there or not, there does come a point in time where you've got to say, this next part of the journey, I need to do something else, or the next part of the journey, I need to keep going with this. And I just really enjoyed the encapsulation of what you've talked about there.
And look, Tim, you probably realize as well, there's more that I didn't say than I said. I mean, there are just so many moving parts to these things.
There's no doubt in that. But I think what you have said, for me, Mark, is that are the key things about the honesty, about the fact that goodwill only goes a little way. You've got to pay people. It's, if you want professionals to work with you and for you, you've got to treat them as professionals. You've got to be fair to them in that sense. The talent garden is a fascinating story because, you talked about families and you had there was a great enthusiasm when you talked about the talent garden. What was the one thing that separated a few? If you look back at your time there, in a positive way, what was the one you said, this is different because of whatever it is?
Yeah. I mean, business is about people at the end of the day, because whether it's buying things, selling things, you can choose. And so also when we are in the world of work, hopefully we can choose the different things that we decide to do. But when I met the leadership team of Talent Garden, very high caliber, very enthusiastic, very good, very interesting, multinational. There were, people that, that I was very impressed by. And, I felt that it was a great privilege to be welcomed into their group. And, you know, within that leadership team were the founders of it. So it's no small thing, like you're really being invited in. And it was the scale up. So I'd done the startup thing, you know, and I wanted to be involved in a scale up thing. And all of the kind of, it wasn't hedonistic, I wouldn't say that, but all of the great enthusiasm and, you know, trying to work, having quite a lot of money and trying to deploy it in the most responsible way to the investors, but also recognizing that you have to, in that intensity, keep your staff coming with you, because not all of them are going to get the same upside, for example, as the investors. So how do you square that? And I think they did a great job. Now, these things ebb and flow. I'd like to see any company that manages to have, like, you know, their scores always, you know, in the 90s. But I thought that the genuine will to do it, I was very impressed by with Talent Garden.
Well, Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you here today. You said something earlier about the influences of your mom and dad. So you said two words, you know, one was mushy and one was a donkey. Okay, so I'm just visualizing this mushy donkey roaming around the sugar loaf and also looking at the nursery and writing his or her name on the wall through what has really been a fascinating journey that you've shared, you know, with us here today, you know, to the EPA across Europe and then across the world. And now you're, you know, in Trinity in the innovation space. And I've no doubt that you'll be as successful in that journey as you have been in your journey today. Thank you for watching The Mindset Shift. For more episodes, check out www.talenthub.ie/The Mindset Shift.